Today's presentation is going to be on the John Quincy Adams presidency and the Andrew Jackson presidency. Look at the reasons for the transformation in American politics. Look at the many economic issues underlying these changes. Now, it all starts back with the election of 1824. You have four candidates running in a one-party system. The Congressional Caucus is falling away. Crawford is the last candidate ever nominated by the Congressional Caucus. The others are nominated by different state legislatures. The hard-fought election, turning on sectional allegiances, Jackson gets a plurality of the votes, but doesn't get a majority of the votes, so it has to go to the House of Representatives where the issue is going to be decided. The top three candidates are decided on. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, is going to play kingmaker. And then the end of this, John Quincy Adams wins. The delegations, voting by states, choose Adams over Jackson. Now, Jackson supporters are upset over this, but it's well known that Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay don't like each other very much. Clay always felt very jealous of Jackson, and Jackson just felt that Clay was just a little too squirrely for his taste. Now, what ends up happening afterwards really enrages Jackson's supporters. The incident can be known as the corrupt bargain. Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, is named Secretary of State by Adams. Now, why that was so upsetting was because by this point in American history, most people saw the Secretary of State position as a springboard to the presidency. Consider some of the previous Secretaries of State. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State under George Washington. He became the nation's third president. James Madison, who was Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, became president immediately after Jefferson. James Monroe, who was Secretary of State under James Madison, became the nation's fifth president immediately after Madison. John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State under President Monroe and becomes the nation's sixth president. And now Henry Clay, Secretary of State, which means they're priming him to become president. Now, the 21st century, that may not seem like such an issue because the last Secretary of State to become president was James Buchanan in 1857. But immediately, Crawford supporters united with Jackson. Jackson supporters were outraged and demanding a rematch in 1828. Insisting that this was corruption. Essentially, the presidency was sold in order to make Adams president. Now, there's no evidence of any kind of collusion or conspiracy between Clay and Adams or any of their supporters. It's really kind of out of nature for either one of them. There's no indication of any unusual visits or unusual reports in either any of their journals or any of their contemporaries or any unusual letters. But it looks really bad after a very divisive election. Adams, who came in second in the election, ended up becoming president. And for the Senate, they went with the only candidate that was nominated by any state, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Now, Crawford himself would not be much of a factor in politics at this point. He had been Secretary of Treasury. He'd done an able job, but he was stricken with some unknown malady that left him mostly paralyzed. He never fully recovered from. Possibly stroke, but no one's ever really sure. But while a decent enough man, he is essentially retired from politics at this point. So the anti-Adams forces are now looking to Andrew Jackson. Now, as for Adams himself, like I said, a fine intellect, hard worker, very moral man. This is the first father-son presidential combination in history. Only removed 12 office holders during his administration. Didn't believe in patronage. He believed in putting the right people in the right positions. After his presidency, he is the only president to return to the House of Representatives. serving a district in Massachusetts for the remainder of his life. From Massachusetts, he's against slavery, but at this point, slavery issues didn't take much importance during his presidency. But after his presidency, when he returns to Congress, he's a more outspoken opponent of slavery. So he's the son of John Adams. He was a respected diplomat, ambassador to 4 different nations during his career: England, France, the Netherlands, Russia. Secretary of State negotiated numerous treaties with other nations, including Spain. And he has very grandiose plans for the nation. He's announcing his first presidential address, calling for a new system of improved roads across the nation to improve the nation's infrastructure. That is, internal improvements. Help people and goods get from point A to point B. He's calling for a national university. It's like the military academies, and now just one for the civilians. Calling for scientific exploration of the continent. Calling for national observatories, that is, astronomical study across the continent. Calling for reforms of patent laws. Calls for creating for a new Department of the Interior, which doesn't come along for a couple decades yet. And for laws encouraging agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. He's a very principled man and refused to play politics, which damaged him immediately. In politics, there's a lot of give and take that has to be done. People have to make compromises. People are trying to protect their own interests, their own communities, as well as those of the nation. But so Adams kept shooting himself in the foot. Wouldn't play the political game. Adams once said to refrain from using the broad powers of the federal government, his words, quote, would be treachery to the most sacred of trusts. Thomas Jefferson, still alive, still outspoken on national issues, said they seem to be making, quote, a single and splitted government of an aristocracy. And immediately his comments like this raised all the suspicions that all the Adamses and the old Federalists. The new party system is going to start emerging and start splitting into factions. The Jeffersonian Republicans, the Republican Party, splits into 2 new factions. The National Republicans, led by Adams and Clay, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jackson. But again, remember, none of these have anything to do with the modern Republican Party. This is going to end up becoming the Whig Party or the Jackson administration. This is going to becoming the Democratic Party under Jackson, the modern Democratic Party. The Whig Party will become extinct. Neither one having anything to do with the modern Republican Party. Well, the most damaging issues regarding Adams had to do with the tariff. He's able to get a few road projects through, but he's not able to get these observatories or this national university off the ground. The Department of the Interior, it's not really happening. But the Panic of 1819 spurred calls for a higher tariff. This one just to meet revenue demands. They already have a protective tariff in place, but the government had such a great shortfall of funding because of trade drying up during the Panic of 1819. They just needed to pay the bills. So the proposed tariff was pushed through in 1820, nearly passed but failed. 1824, another tariff proposal comes through, called quite simply the Tariff of 1824. This favored New England and Mid-Atlantic manufacturers with duties. There's tariffs on woolen items, cotton, iron, and other furnished goods. That is, high taxes on goods being brought into the country. Now, the tariff on raw wool brought a lot of support from woolens manufacturers. A lot of contentious debate, but it passes. Well, now 1828, I want to see John C. Calhoun. Calhoun actually supported tariffs initially in mid-18 teens. South Carolina was starting to develop some industry and is hoping to encourage it along, but South Carolina just stalls out. So all that money going into industry, industrialization, is going into plantations and more slaves. So what ends up happening is all those competing factories and mills in the north start taking off. All that extra capital, instead of being dumped into slavery, starts being poured into industrialization. So they have the extra capital to keep pushing them along, and so they start out-competing the South. And before long, where the North and South are relatively even industrially, in industrial terms, the North starts outpacing the South. The South's economy is stalling out. So they're stuck with one type of economy, a plantation, agricultural style economy, and they refuse to diversify or invest in anything but the system they have. So Calhoun, being from South Carolina, his first, last, and only interest was South Carolina. He loved South Carolina. He was practically a god in South Carolina politics. Anything Calhoun wanted, Calhoun could get, because he always took care of South Carolina. So Calhoun, like a lot of people in South Carolina, starts blaming the tariffs for all South Carolina's increasing economic problems. Well, thousands of people are leaving the state, heading west for better opportunities, and everyone's blaming the tariff for this. What was happening was they had an economy so tied to slavery, slave-based agriculture, that they were shooting themselves in the foot. They had to sell these products abroad. They still could have sold them to the north, but selling most of them abroad. Prices going up there, because sales diminishing somewhat because of these higher tariffs they put in response to our tariffs, these other countries. But also, they're buying finished goods and products from abroad. Farming equipment, clothes for their slaves, being imported because this tariff had higher and higher costs. And this equipment, clothing, everything else needed for these plantations, that's coming at a higher cost, cutting into their profit margins. So instead of getting rid of slaves or making them pay for their own goods, or trying to develop a manufacturing in their own state, they start blaming the tariff. Well, Jackson is not really speaking out much on these issues. It's kind of riding the wave of anti-Adams sentiment. But Calhoun comes up with a plan. Keep himself in power, kick Adams out of the presidency, and bring Jackson in as president. He thinks Jackson is less favorable to the tariff. So, what he's going to try to do is discredit Adams on the tariff issue. What Calhoun's going to do is he's going to propose a tariff. Well, not himself, but he's going to have one of his congressional allies do this thing, trying to keep Calhoun's fingerprints off this. Basically trying to push through secretly this tariff that is so high that it can't possibly pass. But not so high that it's just dismissed immediately. Raised high enough where it can't pass, but not so high that it doesn't cause some controversy behind tariff supporters, which would include Adams. So, 1828 is coming into vote. They're calling it the Tariff of Abominations. Well, here's what happens. It's being pushed through quietly. Calhoun's denouncing it immediately, even though he's quietly the one pushing it through. He's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Adams is quietly supporting, but watching the debate. But in the meantime, you have all these other congressmen who were interested in tariffs, and They're looking around this bill, sitting carefully, and they realize, you change a couple things here and there. This may not be such a bad tariff. Let's find some common ground. Let's make a few cuts and change here and there. Pass this bill. So here's what happens. The tariff that isn't supposed to pass, it passed. And as a result, South Carolina is horrified. People grumbling about secession already in 1828 because of this tariff. They feel like they're attacking South Carolina. And so Calhoun goes to South Carolina, tries to calm everybody down, tries to explain his opposition to protective tariffs, and anonymously issues a pamphlet while he's down there, try to give South Carolina something else to munch on, to rally around, and to keep them in the Union. It's a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Pamphlet he issued anonymously in 1828. And basically, he's trying to tell South Carolina that don't worry about the federal government. Don't worry, you can still have everything the way it was. You don't have to change, you don't have to worry about anything, you don't have to worry about your economy. You can have anything you want without any responsibility at all. So explaining this pamphlet is the idea of what they call nullification. The idea that if the federal government passes a law that's unconstitutional, the states can just ignore it. That is, ignore an unconstitutional law. Here's the problem with that. Who's deciding what's unconstitutional? And the Constitution, the last word of constitutionality is the Supreme Court. The Constitution also says states have to follow federal law. So if South Carolina didn't like this law, if it's unconstitutional, they can take it to court. But they don't do that. They try to have it overturned in Congress, but they don't do that. Instead, what Calhoun's saying is just ignore it. Constitutionality law is being determined by the South Carolina state legislature. Well, people start attacking on this, thinking states had these rights to say whatever they wanted to. The states should be able to follow whatever laws they wanted to and ignore anything that's unconstitutional. How are they defining anything unconstitutional in this case? Anything they don't like. So this is going to be becoming an issue in the next few years. Well, during the Adams presidency, you have a rather sad occasion for Adams and for the nation. On July 4th, 1826, the nation's 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. Like I said, they managed to repair their relationship in later years. They never saw each other after Adams left office in 1801. The 1800 election was a rather strained relationship, but they managed to patch things together. Like I said, they wrote to each other warmly. They never got to see each other. Their last words were speaking warmly of the other. Then they died on the nation's 50th anniversary. People consider it a sign from God that because here on the golden anniversary of the nation's independence, He takes two of the nation's greatest surviving founding fathers, second and third President of the United States, two men who had helped draft the Declaration of Independence. It's going to be a divine blessing, God's blessing the United States. Well, a few years later, something happens again. July 4th, 1831. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, died on the nation's Independence Day. People are also considering this a sign of divine approval, God's blessing the nation. 1836 rolls around. James Monroe is in ill health that summer, and people are trying to get him to try to extend his life and trying to see if they can push it even further. He'll die on July 4th, too. They'll tell him to take things like arsenic and strychnine. They're poisons, but those are regularly prescribed medications in those days. But Monroe won't play along and dies in late June of 1836. very strange episode in American history, but people are believing that the death was a sign of approval. Now we get to the election of 1828. Now, if you think you've seen dirty elections before, negative campaigning, you have not seen the 1820 election. Compared to what goes on in the late 20th and 21st century, amateurs. This is the dirtiest negative election in American history. Andrew Jackson against John Quincy Adams. They're back for the rematch, and they're pulling out all the stops. Jackson, the Democratic-Republican faction, and John Quincy Adams for the National Republicans. Well, Adams fires with everything he's got. Jackson returns the favor. Jackson is accused of being hot-tempered and ignorant, co-conspirator with Aaron Burr, also accused of adultery. He lived with his wife, Rachel Donaldson, for 2 years before Jackson, who was a lawyer, learned that Rachel's divorce from her first husband had not been finalized. Like I said, Rachel Donaldson's first husband was a cruel man, very abusive. She left him. But see, in those days, early 19th century, it literally took an act of the state legislature in some cases to get a divorce. Very difficult things to do. Very complicated legal maneuvers. And Jackson, even though he's a lawyer, missed something. So technically the divorce was invalid. So this was a couple of years afterward. Rachel Donaldson's technically legally a bigamist. Well, Jackson rushed back through everything, got everything finalized. This time the divorce is clear. But 1828, the Adams people bring this up and accuse Rachel Donaldson of being a bigamist, Jackson of being an adulterer. For a proud woman like Rachel Donaldson, she loved Andrew Jackson. So whatever else you might think of Andrew Jackson, he loved his wife more than anything in the world. Very precious, dear things to him. He got in several fistfights and duels with anybody who ever dared say a word about her. Well, now it's being brought up in the election, and Rachel Donaldson is not worried so much what they're saying about her, but what they're saying about her Andrew. It's so worried that it might damage his ambitions, his plans for the presidency so badly that she gets sick and she dies. Jackson spends the rest of his life blaming his opponents for her death. And for Jackson, politics wasn't just a hobby or just one of those things. It was something he took very personally. Well, the Jackson people, they give as good as they can get. They accuse Adams of being a spendthrift and a gambler because he bought a pool table for the White House. Also accused him of pimping for the Tsar of Russia, claiming that while he was ambassador, he brought young girls, very, very young girls, to the attention of the Tsar. Say, well, this is true or not, we really don't know. Well, Jackson is a war hero. He's a self-made man, son of the West. He's about to be the first president from west of the Appalachians. It's almost unbeatable there, those states west of the Appalachians. In the South, his credentials as a planter, a slaveholder, won him acceptance. Debtors in the Panic of 1819 and local bankers supported Jackson. Jackson had lost money during this panic, and he had opposed the Bank of the United States. The state banks didn't like the competition from the Bank of the U.S. The thing is, Jackson's vague on a lot of issues. Doesn't say a lot, so interest groups had difficulty in attacking him. Seen as one of the people, a common man, which was very appealing in an era of the expanding vote. This is a time of expansion, expanding voting rights for people, expanding frontier, a nation growing its prosperity. So the self-made man, the man who comes from nothing and builds himself up, that's seen as the ideal. And Jackson is the embodiment of that. Men all on the frontier struggling to scratch out a living, they see something of themselves in Jackson. A man who literally went from poverty to become the richest man in Tennessee. And all men thought, maybe they couldn't do as well as Jackson, they at least do good enough. Do a lot better than what they're doing. Jackson was the example. But Adams is from an old aristocratic family who has a lot of difficulty in this atmosphere. One Jackson campaign slogan was, Adams can write, but Jackson can fight. So in this election, Jackson wins overwhelmingly. Electoral vote 178 to 83. Landslide election. So you can see here on page 286 in the book. So they have Adams only taking portions of the Mid-Atlantic states and the Northeast. See a picture of Adams on page 283 and a picture of Calhoun on page 299. The electoral map here on page 286. That's a landslide election. 647,000 votes for Jackson. 56% of the popular vote. Adams getting 509,000 votes. 44%. Landslide for Andrew. But this is something that just indicates just how rapidly the right to vote is expanding. Voting barriers are falling all over the country. Previously, where you might have to own a piece of land or at least prove you paid some taxes, more and more they're moving to what they called universal suffrage. But the universe they meant was white men. Typically, historians have commodified this by saying universal male suffrage, trying to get all men to vote. So in many states, basically, any man who's over 21 can vote. Just be upright and breathing, and you can vote. In some cases, they may waive the breathing part, but that's a different story. But the right to vote expanded so rapidly between 1824 and 1828 that Adams had won more votes in 1828 than had been cast in the entire 1824 election. But he still loses in a landslide. Calhoun is elected as vice president. He's hoping to be able to manipulate the incoming Jackson. But Jackson is not a man to be manipulated. Certainly not a man to be trifled with. So there's a new spirit of democracy in the nation. Jackson actually has very little to do with it, but he has embodied the spirit of the times. In fact, Andrew Jackson really is the first where we start getting the idea that any man can grow up in this country to become president. While it's legally, technically possible, Jackson made it a reality. Any man can grow up to become president, or any woman. States are opening the franchise to all men, start opening the franchise to all men earlier, and during his presidency, expanded even more after the 1828 election. Vermont, 1790, Georgia and New Hampshire become the first states for the idea to allow universal suffrage for all men, basically any man over 21, any resident over 21. Starting in 1790, Vermont by 1791. Start seeing coming in elsewhere. Kentucky became a state in 1792. New Jersey by 1807. And all the new states coming in the West all had universal suffrage or extremely low tax paying requirements. Basically prepaid any kind of taxes. Kind of more and more. In 1824, 6 states state legislatures still chose the electors instead of the people directly. In 1832, only South Carolina. Jackson is the last Revolutionary War veteran to become president. He was born in 1767 in South Carolina. His father died before he was born. He had an older brother. At age 13, he served as a messenger for the Revolutionary forces in South Carolina in 1780. Well, he and his brother were both caught on a mission. Basically, Jackson delivered messages back and forth to the Continental forces. And when he's captured, he and his older brother, a British officer, was very cruel to them. Ordered Jackson to shine his boots. Jackson refused, and knowing Jackson, probably said a few other things to him. So, officer took the butt of his sword and hit Jackson in the head with it. Jackson ended up having a scar on his head the rest of the life from it. The boots still will not shine. And so they're taken to, his brother's also beaten, they're taken to a POW camp. Now, this time in the Revolutionary War, prisoner of war camps basically had holding areas until troops could be exchanged. Now, afterward, after the POW camps, their armies either exchanging one group of soldiers for another, or sometimes trying to make exceptions for individuals. What happens is their mother finds out about it. She goes to this POW camp to have her two sons, both far under 18, to be freed from British custody. Well, she manages to get it done. But here's the problem. A smallpox epidemic erupted in this POW camp. So, sanitary conditions are very poor. Disease is spreading very rapidly. In fact, in most wars in the 18th and 19th century, most men died from disease rather than battlefield injuries. So Jackson's mother and brother both contract smallpox and both die. So now at the age of 14, Jackson is utterly alone, completely orphaned. A lot of cases, a lot of people would fall apart in those circumstances, but Jackson pulls himself together. It's kind of a wild period for a while. They start studying law in South Carolina. Basically, he's apprenticed to a lawyer in the community. He's studying the law, and eventually they have this process. Basically, you study the law, read all the law books under a practicing lawyer. The lawyer shows you how to conduct yourself in court. And then you go before a local judge, and you're basically the judge quizzes you on your knowledge of the law and procedure in the courtrooms. And if he's satisfied, you're sworn into the bar. You become a lawyer. Well, Jackson made the bar in the early 20s. He then traveled to Tennessee, a brand new state, and made a name for himself as a local prosecutor. Served in the Tennessee militia, rising to the rank of Major General. Hero of Battle of New Orleans. Planter and slaveholder, had a plantation just east of Nashville called the Hermitage. Still there today. Still has they still have tours. Becomes a very wealthy man. In fact, he becomes the richest man in the state of Tennessee. Eventually governor of Tennessee, U.S. Senator from Tennessee, briefly governor of the Florida Territory. But his reputation for temper is well founded. He fought in several duels. In fact, he had one case in his mid-30s. He had fought in this duel with one man that nearly killed him. See, Jackson was fond of betting on horses. And there was a dispute after one race, some accusations of cheating or something else like that. And Jackson gets in this argument with one man. Words flying back and forth. And this other man makes a nasty remark about Jackson's wife. That's something you don't do. Jackson challenges him to a duel. Honor must be satisfied. He's not going to take this insult to his wife. So they make all the arrangements, their seconds and everything, and make all the arrangements. And they meet. Well, on the appointed day, Jackson meets with his adversary. But here's the thing. The man Jackson challenged to a duel had a reputation of being the fastest draw in Kentucky. This man had fought several duels before, won every one of them. Came out unscathed. Very quick draw, very accurate draw. A lot of men were dead at this man's hands. Jackson doesn't care. So furious, this man, what he said about his wife. So Jackson shows up one day, on the appointed day. And what he's doing is he's wearing a kind of loose-fitting clothes. We see this dot of the ties at the base of my neck. Basically, wearing clothes are a little baggy, so it makes everything look like it's like 1 or 2 inches lower than where it should be, particularly where the heart might be. So they get their dueling pistols, the classic one-shot pistol. They step it off, count off 1, 9, 10. They turn. Guy gets off his shot. Pow! Jackson hit right in the chest. Bullet right by the heart. And that bullet's going to be by his heart the rest of his life. They can't operate on it those days. Not that kind of surgery. Jackson doesn't flinch. Just stands there. But the way duel works is each person gets off their one shot. That guy got up his shot, Jackson's still standing. Now he has to stand there while Jackson gets off his shot. Jackson works, aims very carefully, points his pistol at the man, pulls the trigger, misfire. Pull back the trigger again, try again. Pow! Right between the eyes. Guy's dead on the spot. Jackson struts off the field like nothing happened. Jackson barely escapes a murder indictment over that, but everyone knows better after that than to challenge Andrew Jackson to a duel. Still got several fistfights here and there, but just want to show just how determined Andrew Jackson would be. And basically brought himself up from nothing, frontier fighter. No one going to tell Andrew Jackson what to do. Well, Jackson, his inauguration on March 4th, 1829, he announces the White House is the people's house. Invites all the people to come to the White House. There are 15,000 spectators at inauguration, a record at the time. But at this time, he's plagued with headaches and a cough. He spoke in a soft voice that few could hear. He's 62 years old at this point. Next day, he looked like warmed over death at this point, but he's just so stubborn so that nothing's going to stop him, slow him down. So the White House opened to all. Everyone came. Thousands of spectators coming into the White House. They are bringing mud in tracked all over the house, dishes broken, furniture broken. People just trying to climb on the furniture to get a look at the man or shake his hand. In fact, it's so bad that President Jackson's about to get smushed by all this big crowd. They have to get him out through a window. The first night as president, Jackson has to stay at a local tavern he'd stayed in the night before. Well, Jackson had an unofficial group of political advisors he called the Kitchen Cabinet. It's the old friends of his, old political allies, who gave him advice on a number of issues in addition to his regular cabinet. Jackson felt that officials should be regularly rotated in and out of office, that the government belonged to the people, and the officials should turn to status of regular citizens after the terms of office were over. Believing the idea, to the victor go the spoils. That's where this idea begins. And appoints his political allies. And already his administration, a struggle for power began, particularly between the new Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren of New York, and Vice President John C. Calhoun. Van Buren was a masterful politician, known in New York as the Little Magician. He's 5 foot nothing, but magical because he always seemed to be able to pull out votes and election victories out of places they never could have imagined. Calhoun was steadily narrower in his views, humorous outlook, his apostolic zeal, towering intellect, very intelligent man, but very narrow in his views, not much of a sense of humor. Ardent love for South Carolina's region. Now the fight comes over the Secretary of War, a man named John Henry Eaton. Eaton and his new wife, Peggy, had supposedly become involved while she was still married. Peggy Eaton's husband had died. He owned a popular tavern in Washington, D.C. And after her husband died, Peggy Eaton and John Henry married 3 months later. Raised a lot of eyebrows in Washington. Well, Mrs. Eaton was looked down on in Washington society because her husband had been a working man. Plus, circumstances of her new marriage. Well, Calhoun's wife, Florida Calhoun, basically kind of the matriarch of Washington society. Run all the big fancy high society balls and everything. Basically, everybody kind of looked to her. And Mrs. Calhoun did not like Mrs. Eaton. Made it very clear to her husband she did not approve of her, putting John C. Calhoun in a very uncomfortable position. He wanted to please his boss at work, but also he doesn't want to have to sleep on the couch at home. So he sat with his wife. Well, all these nasty things being said about Peggy Eaton reminded Andrew Jackson of all the horrible things that are being said about his wife. So Jackson felt some sympathy for the Eatons and spoke out in their defense in public, in cabinet meetings. And so what happens is Van Buren rallies to his defense, rallies to their defense as well. Publicly befriending them, inviting them over to his house. He goes over to their house. They become really close friends. Actually, Van Buren realizes there's a political component to it, but they were genuinely close to each other, or genuinely liked each other. And so, where Martin Van Buren didn't have to do this, he decides to do it. And Jackson is very touched by how Van Buren is taking to the Eatons, and very upset by how Florida Calhoun is attacking Mrs. Eaton, and how John C. Calhoun is just standing by and doing it. The two do not like each other too much, and that relationship is going to disintegrate. Well, Van Buren also said Calhoun and Jackson had odds through federal internal improvements. Calhoun had long been identified as such programs. Jackson's a little more hesitant to embrace. Doesn't like, kind of worried about where all the money's coming from, how it's being spent, worried about some contractors on the take or something like that. So it comes down to 1830, the Maysville Road Bill. Now it's a national road, federally funded, but it's only within Kentucky. It doesn't cross state lines, so there's no issue of interstate commerce. But it's typically linked the national road with Ohio, link it with another road. But Jackson vetoes the bill, saying it's unconstitutional. This bill is not what this bill should not be benefiting just one state. But these kind of projects should benefit multiple states, therefore the entire nation. So Jackson vetoes the bill. The federal government starts limiting its involvement in federal projects. Calhoun is very upset because he had pushed very hard with this bill. When early railroad projects start coming through, most of them are mostly going to be built through the states and through private investors. And now nullification comes up again. South Carolina suffering from a serious economic depression. 70,000 people left the state in the 1820s and 140,000 leave in the 1830s, and they're all blaming the tariff. Ratio of slaves to whites is on the rise in South Carolina. In addition to all this, you have, in 1822, the Denmark-Vesey Revolt. This is in 1822. Denmark-Vesey was a slave in South Carolina, plotted to spark a slave insurrection in South Carolina, planning to others. It's a very extensive revolt, but plot is found out at the last minute. Vesey is arrested, and the plot is diffused before it takes place. But it terrifies South Carolina. So more and more people in South Carolina are being held enslaved. In fact, it's going to get to the point where the majority of people are held in slavery. And then you have a large free black population on top of that. Whites starting to feel marginalized, surrounded, terrified. The Denmark-Vesey Revolt, that's their worst nightmare come true. And such plots really were happening. Now, the tariff of 1828 was an explosive issue in South Carolina. Calhoun issued his theories of nullification to quell secessionist sentiment. That nullification was very popular in South Carolina. It carried out government abandon the law or have to push through a constitutional amendment to clear up its constitutional validity. Now, Daniel Webster and northern politicians announcing South Carolina's actions and the nullification theory. They got the Jefferson Day dinner in 1830. This is a big occasion for the Democratic Party. Calhounites giving toasts extolling states' rights. Jackson gives a simple toast staring at Calhoun, our Union. It must be preserved. Calhoun is furious at this, and makes a slap in the face to him. Calhoun raises up his glass, trembling his hand from the rage, and the Union, next to our liberty most dear. It's not there to save himself a lot of trouble, but it keeps going. May remember they want to be preserved by respecting the rights of the states distributed equally, the benefit and the burdens of the Union. So it was a very uncomfortable night. Example of the rage between the two. Shortly afterward, Jackson finds Calhoun's old proposal to discipline Jackson for attacking Florida back in 1890. Remember, Monroe sent that cryptic letter to Jackson saying he could take Florida in 60 days if he just gave the word. Calhoun, who was Secretary of War at that time, said Jackson should be disciplined after he heard about it. Monroe didn't say anything, but remember the old saying, what goes around comes around. Karma, it's real, it works. Well, this letter had been filed away years ago. Somebody finds it and brings it to Jackson's attention. Jackson demands an explanation. It fires off a series of angry letters, resulting in Jackson dismissing his entire cabinet to get rid of all Calhoun's men. But Jackson names Van Buren, who had always been loyal to him, as ambassador to Great Britain in late 1831. But the vote comes to a tie in the Senate. Van Buren's already in London acting as acting ambassador. Calhoun, as vice president, has to cast a tie-breaking vote. Votes against Van Buren as ambassador. Galati says, "It will kill him, sir. Kill him dead," referring to his political carcass. But Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri disagrees. Benton and Jackson have been around a few times. They've been in a few fistfights, but they're close on a lot of issues. Benton tells Calhoun he had broken a minister but elected the vice president. The vote provoked popular sympathy for Van Buren, and he's put on the ticket with Jackson in 1832. Obviously, he's not going to go with Calhoun again. Calhoun's dreams of becoming president are dashed. He's the leader of nullificationists, tries to get the reduction of the tariff, but Jackson pushes through the tariff of 1832, lowering rates a little bit, but not enough to satisfy South Carolina. New tariff. Lowering it a bit, but not enough. Not what South Carolina wanted. Not so little that it's a slap in the face. So here's what ends up happening. South Carolina legislature, after their elections in 1832, they come back into session, adopt the nullification ordinance. (1832) South Carolina law denouncing the tariffs of 1828 and 32 as unconstitutional. It also forbade the collection of federal duties after February 1st, 1833. Calhoun, since he's always about to be out of work here, he's chosen by the state legislature, which is how things were done at that time, as the senator for South Carolina. Calhoun will hold this job for the rest of his life. Calhoun returns to Washington to defend nullification in South Carolina, but the North is lining up against nullification, and the rest of the South is lining up against it as well. Jackson announces his firm intention to oppose the nullification ordinance, no matter the cost. Says federal Federal supremacy must be and the Constitution must be upheld, but urges Congress to lower the tariff rates in the meantime. But Jackson states clearly the purpose of the nullifiers is disunion. Fires off an angry letter to South Carolina, warning them that his duty as president is to uphold the law and uphold the Constitution. He has no choice in the matter, and he will do so. He will do his duty. And any attempt to ignore federal law will be dealt with harshly. He warns the people of South Carolina that the goal of the nullification is disunion. And disunion by armed force is treason. Jackson would deal with it appropriately. Warned the people of the dangers of the Civil War, said that the civil wars in our neighboring republics, do they invite your envy? Because this is what's going to happen. The Civil War about to happen 30 years before it does, over nullification. The entire South has denounced nullification. South Carolina is utterly alone. Jackson is sharpening his knives. So January 1833, you have the Force Bill. Jackson calls for a bill to allow him to use the military to enforce federal law in South Carolina. He already has that authority, just wants to back in Congress to make a statement to South Carolina. If they go through with this, he's coming after them. And there will be no stopping him. Well, the Force Bill passes. Jackson's also pushing through a measure to cut the tariff. Basically, offering South Carolina a way out, offering them a way to save face, offering a way to back off of this. Henry Clay, using anything else, he was very good at crafting compromise and getting bills through Congress. So Clay uses his legislative skill, crafts a bill to cut the tariff in half. Tariff rates for cotton be cut in half over the next 10 years. It passes the compromise tariff. Cuts cotton tariffs in half over the next 10 years. South Carolina backs down at this point. Jackson signs both the Force Bill and the new tariff on March 1st, 1833. South Carolina rescinds nullification, but nullifies the Force Bill as a last parting gesture. Both sides claim victory. Jackson, for the first time, justified the use of force against a state that refused to comply with federal law. South Carolina was threatening to secede. This time, they offered a way out, but Jackson declares very firmly that the Union will be maintained. The purpose of the Constitution is to create a more perfect Union. Tearing it apart would not make it more perfect. So, nullification process averted fairly. Meanwhile, the Native American issues. Jackson had a typically Western attitude about Native Americans. They're better off out of the way. Moving Indians, tribes west of the Mississippi River, they believed, was the best policy to keep peace between the tribes and settlers. The settlers wanting all this land and Trans-Appalachian West, but moving the tribes west of the Mississippi, they basically moved these settlers way ahead of the settlement, basically pushing them out of the way. Fights break out all the time, bringing the state militias to bring them down. The Army's been fighting Native American tribes for years, but what happens is treaties made, borders are set out, but some settlers start wandering onto this land. It's very good farmland. And tribes see this, arguments break out, erupts into gunfights and warfare. State militias or U.S. Army brought in, battles won, tribes lose, borders redrawn, tribes have less and less land. Same story over and over and over again. Well, the tribes have bad reputation since Europeans first arrived in the New World. Some people on the frontier, a lot of politicians are saying the tribes should be outright exterminated. That the United States should resort to a policy of outright genocide, just killing every one of them. In fact, during the years of the Republic of Texas, the President Mirabeau Lamar had said that in his inaugural address that the tribes of Texas should be, in his words, expelled or exterminated. Jackson, somewhat of a moderate, believed that the tribes should not be exterminated, that they did deserve some protection, but they should simply be moved out of the way, regardless of what treaties had said. But there are very few people speaking out for the rights of Native Americans at this point. Very, very few. So Jackson's plan in this regard was the Indian Removal Act, law passed in 1831. It's approved by a narrow margin and government appropriated $500,000 for the removal. Basically, payments for the Army to remove these tribes from their lands to lands in Oklahoma at gunpoint. There'd be 5 major tribes involved here, south of the Ohio River. The Cherokees, Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and the Choctaws. The map of this is on page 307. Choctaws lived mostly in southern Mississippi by this point. Chickasaws mostly in northern Mississippi. Cherokees kind of straddle some of those borders here, the lower Appalachians, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, portions of northern Georgia. Still a large community of Cherokees on the North Carolina-Tennessee line to this day. Creek tribe, mostly southern Alabama. Southern and eastern Alabama, to be precise. Seminoles, large portions of Florida. But all being proposed to move to an area that is now present-day Oklahoma. This whole territory at this point would be called the Indian Territory. It's not be called Oklahoma until after the 1889 land rush. The Oklahoma Territory at that point. But essentially, the Arkansas Territory was cut in half. The western half becomes the Indian Territory, where all these tribes would be relocated. The eastern half becoming the present that will become the state of Arkansas in 1836. Now, there's still a couple tribes here in Arkansas, Quapaw, but Cherokees and others. But by 1835, before Arkansas becomes a state, all those tribes would be pushed out of the state and into the Indian Territory. There's a small group of Cherokees near Fort Smith. They are pushed back across the line. Well, the Cherokees objected to the plan, as did the other tribes. Cherokees are probably the most Western-looking tribes in their culture, of any of the cultures. They had a Republican form of government. That is, they had elected representative assemblies, elected local councils. They had made their language a written one, borrowing from the English alphabet. They had newspapers, because they lived in settled communities. There were farmers. So not a lot of difference between them and the settlers, except they were on land that the white settlers wanted. It was a very sophisticated society. And the official argument was the government attempting to civilize the tribes, that is, make them more Anglo-American, and preserve them from the actions of frontier settlers, subject the tribes to skirmishes and bad moral influences. That is, Jackson and removal supporters say they are protecting the tribes. Well, missionaries argued that the Cherokees, many of whom had adopted Christianity, that they really weren't accepted. They were very good, moral people, hard-working people. They were not, any kind of influences from the settlers, any kind of bad moral influences, something didn't happen to the Cherokee tribes. It's just not part of their culture. It's not anything they did. But Cherokees are good people and should be left alone. Now the Cherokees decide they're going to play the legal game too. They take their case to court. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Case Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. Supreme Court rules that the Cherokees had a legal right to their lands. It had to do with the Georgia law saying that anybody entering Cherokee lands in Georgia had to have a permit, particularly those who are involved in sales, merchants, and so forth. Well, the Cherokees said this law by federal treaty was their land, and they could admit into their territories, into their lands, anybody they wanted to. They didn't need a permit from the state of Georgia. These people didn't need a permit from the state of Georgia. They could just come on across because the Cherokees said they could. Well, Supreme Court agreed that the Cherokees, that this is their land, this is their territory, they can make the rules. It's a legal, binding treaty. The state could not have any right to extend its jurisdiction over the tribes. Tribes could not be removed. It was their land. Jackson's response, from Chief Justice John Marshall, Mr. Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. Jackson allowed the states to force out the tribes. In 1833, all the southeastern tribes except the Cherokees were gone. Basically, moved by force by the U.S. Army across the state lines, that's them going through Arkansas and into the Indian Territory. This whole incident is called the Trail of Tears. Each tribe had its own story to tell, but in 1838, when the Cherokees were removed, federal troops removed the last of them. They're forced on a long march without any rest or very little shelter or food. All the way to the Indian Territory. And they have time to stop to bury the dead. There were many dead. Of the 13,000 Cherokees forced along the Trail of Tears, 4,000 died along the way. And all this heading into the election of 1832. Now remember, the tribes can't vote at this point. And this act was very popular in the South. But the upcoming early issue was the Bank of the United States. Nicholas Biddles, the director of the Bank of the United States, came from a wealthy family in Philadelphia, ardent defender of the bank and its benefits for the financial system of the nation. He facilitated a steady business expansion in the U.S. and a stable currency by forcing state banks to back up their currency with a specie reserve. And a specie reserve here is just basically gold and silver. The currency had to be backed up with gold and silver. Some money they all agreed on was real money. 1825 and 1828, it acted to quickly prevent an overextension of credit and prevent another downturn. But see, Jackson hates banks. Very common feeling along the western frontier. Felt they're speculative in nature and could ruin the people. Jackson once told Biddle, said, "I don't dislike your bank more than I dislike any other bank." But he's going to shut it down. Jackson feared the National Bank had too much influence, probably dangerous to the country, but too much power in private hands. And his 20-year charter ran from 1816 to expire in 1836. But Biddle feared for the future of the bank and forced Congress to write a recharter in 1832. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, is agreeing with the bank recharter, going to make an issue for his party, the National Republicans, in 1832. Both houses of Congress easily renewed the charter, but didn't have the two-thirds vote necessary to override a presidential veto. Jackson vetoed the bank recharter in July 1832, announcing a monopoly and special privilege, arguing the bank was unconstitutional. Efforts to override the veto failed. It's on the election, Jackson's calling the people to rally to him against the monster bank. It's him and the people against the banks. It said that the bank was using all its political power to try to force him from office. Well, in this race, Jackson is nominated for the first National Nominating Commission. That is, delegates from the states, individual citizens, members of the party, came to the National Convention and nominated Jackson for re-election. The National Republicans did similarly their convention later. Well, so it's Andrew Jackson against Henry Clay. Clay has his chance to run for president again, second time. Clay tries to capitalize on wide support for the bank. Really can't do it. It doesn't have quite the charisma, image that Jackson does. There's a third candidate on the ticket running, a man named William Wirt. Running a very unusual third party ticket, the anti-Masonic party ticket. Basically, the Masonic clubs. It's a civic organization, basically men getting together in the community, doing good deeds, charitable works in the communities, far and wide, but they're always very quiet about it. Secretive organization, a secret clubhouse, secret handshake, nothing bad about it. They're always very quiet about the charity work, to make sure it's done. It's a real brotherhood. They take care of each other. They have close friends. But because they're secretive, it's let a lot of people kind of wonder what actually goes on at these meetings. All people saying they're conspiring with each other to overthrow the government, they're devil worshippers, things like that. Nothing the case. It's a biblical Christian organization, just secret. Secret clubhouse, secret handshake. That many of the founding fathers, Ben Franklin, George Washington, among many others, were Masons. But the anti-Masonic party decided this organization had to go. Well, it's only a minor issue in the election. The big issue is Jackson and the bank. Jackson wins overwhelmingly. Gets 54% of the popular vote, 219 electoral votes. Clay gets 38% of the popular vote and only 49 electoral votes. Wirt gets 8% of the vote and wins only the state of Vermont. There goes Jackson, the landslide. And of course, the issue is going to be now the bank war. The bank, Jackson once told his new vice president, Martin Van Buren, just as Benton predicted, the bank is trying to kill me, but I'll kill it. It'll use all his allies use all their influence to defeat Jackson, try to support the bank, but failed. With Jackson's presidency, see the return of the competitive party system. See, partisanship was originally looked down on when the nation began as a potential disaster for the nation. And many shared this sentiment as political parties returned. But Martin Van Buren and his Democratic allies in New York, they called the Albany Regency, basically Albany State is a capital of New York, and their political machine, how they got their allies and everybody elected, they called their group the Albany Regency. They felt that the competitive party system was vital to the preservation of democracy. That is, instead of just individuals running here and there, that you'd have competitive ideologies and organizations that would help people with similar ideas and beliefs get elected. He had forced parties to adjust their philosophies and programs according to the shifting mood of the voters and evolving needs of the country. See, they knew that their ideas would probably have to change over time because the country was going to change over time. Jackson, though, saw parties as entrenched interest groups that spread corruption through appropriations and spread disunity. For Jackson, anyone opposed wasn't somebody who just needed to be opposed personally, someone needed to be destroyed. For example, Davy Crockett fell crossways with Jackson on a number of issues, but Jackson makes sure that he is pushed out of office and defeated as a congressman for Tennessee. Crockett's defeated. He decides to go off to Texas to revive his fortunes, leaving the statement, "Y'all can go to hell, I'm going to Texas." They've been king of the wild frontier, but he couldn't match Andrew Jackson. Well, now Jackson decided he's going to end the government's association with the Bank of the United States, removing federal deposits and then moving them into state banks. Two Treasury secretaries refused to comply with this order. Fires both of them, appoints Roger B. Taney to the post, and withdraws federal funds from the bank, and distributes them into 23 different state banks. By the end of 1833, all these state banks are housing federal funds. They're called pet banks, because Jackson's opponents are accusing him of choosing these banks on the grounds of banks being owned by political allies, rather than financial soundness of the nation, and particularly withdrawing it from the Bank of the United States without congressional approval. Well, the Bank of the United States suffered by lack of capital because all this was money's pulled out of the bank. Responded by calling in bad loans to try to get revenue coming in, and contracting credit, which ended up leading to a recession. It'll hope to win recharter for the bank by showing just how important the bank was to the national economy. Well, Jackson's supporters accused Biddle of basically trying to blackmail the country, saying the bank had caused this recession and basically trying to hold the country hostage by keeping the country in a recession rather than trying to help the country out of this situation. Saying they caused this recession and therefore they not deserve a recharter, because this shows how much power the bank had. The bank had the power to crash the economy. They didn't need to be in business. Too much power in private hands. Too much unquestioned, unaccountable private power. That is, all these private men, all these private bankers, power of life and death over the economy, didn't have to answer to anyone. Many people, that was scary. And all that fed into Jackson's argument why the bank had to go. The bank never gained its charter, but continued briefly after 1836 as a private bank. The Senate responded to Jackson's removal of federal funds from the bank by censuring Jackson, basically a statement of condemnation, for extending its authority and arbitrarily removing these federal funds. But a later Democratic Senate can repeal the censure. Jackson's removal of funds created a speculative wave. Banks mushroomed in hopes of gaining federal deposits as easy, safe money to act as capital, give out loans. What's happening, though, is the amount of federal lands available for settlement rises from 4 million acres in 1834 to 15 million by 1835 and 20 million by 1836. And all this land, in the meantime, is being sold to speculators. They're taking out loans from these state banks, using it to buy all this land, helping to subdivide and sell this land to settlers or rent it out. Land sales cause the government budget surplus to swell. In fact, by the end of Jackson's term in 1837, the federal government has zero debt. Big surplus in the budget, no debt. This is the only time in American history in which a president leaves office debt-free. Well, Jackson, though, never trusted banks or paper money. He issued the Specie Circular in 1836 to repress fraud. We have a lot of fake land certificates circulating, a lot of people using counterfeit money to buy lands. So what it's saying here is the government's going to accept gold or silver payment for the payment of federal lands after August 15, 1836. To this order, and to prevent the monopolization of the public lands by speculators and capitalists, they're hoping make people pay in gold and silver, only a few people will be able to pay it. Instead of having it in a few hands, many people will be able to afford it. Here's the problem is, settlers don't have this kind of money, gold and silver. Banks don't have this money, gold and silver. Few settlers get their hands on species, so they're even more at the mercy of speculators for federal lands. This created disarray in the banking community and eventually caused the bubble to burst by 1837. Now all the surplus they're having, the Distribution Act was passed to return this federal surplus to the states, basically dividing it up evenly. And so they're taking all this money from these so-called pet banks and giving it to these other state banks, which causes these banks to collapse. So you have a lot of destabilization of the banking industry. Jackson steps down in 1836, but he's popular enough, leaving office formally in 1837, but announcing he will not run for a third term. But he's popular enough he can choose his successor. The successor he chooses is Martin Van Buren. You have a now more solidified political system in place, political parties in place. The Democratic Republicans become the Democratic Party, have been ever since. The National Republicans become the Whig Party. So they say Jackson's acting like a tyrant, calling him King Andrew I. They're styling themselves after the old British Liberal Party, supported the colonists of the American Revolution, opposed the royal abuses of power. They said Jackson's acting like a dictator, and they're acting like the Whigs to get rid of the reign of this budding dictator. They absorbed the anti-Masonic Party, a strong party in New England, risen after hysteria surrounding Masonic orders. The Whigs never have a lot of things in common with each other, but basically what unites them is that they hate Andrew Jackson. And in the 1830s, you can get a lot of votes by saying you don't like Andrew Jackson. But the Democratic Party, saying you love Andrew Jackson, there was not a lot in between. You either love the man or you hate him. Not a lot in between. And basically, you're a Jackson supporter, you're a Democrat. Well, some anti-Jackson Democrats have been falling out of favor with Jackson, going to the Whig Party. But Democrats generally aren't too concerned with private morals of people, gambling, church attendance, drinking, and so forth. It's like it's somebody's own business. Tend to be hard money supporters, gold or silver, no paper currency. They support the speedy circular. Afraid what paper money be, afraid of counterfeiting. The Whigs, generally, nearest thing we call them today would be probably an evangelical conservative. But the Whigs, though, decided to play to regional strengths to deprive the Democrats of the election by throwing the election in the House of Representatives. So basically, instead of having one candidate to oppose the Democratic candidate nationally, they're going to have four candidates running nationally, playing to regional strengths. So here's what you've got. You've got William Henry Harrison of Indiana, taking the upper Midwest. Also a candidate of the anti-Masonic Party. Hugh L. White of Tennessee, former Tennessee senator and former Jackson supporter. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, considered to be one of the greatest speakers of all time in American history. And Willie P. Mangum of South Carolina. So all running as Whigs. Van Buren the Democrat. And the whole plan fails because Van Buren gets a majority, 51% of the vote, 170 electoral votes, 764,000 votes total. But the whole Whig total comes up only to 49%, 123 electoral votes. But the path of 1837 is going to rock the Van Buren administration almost from the beginning. Price of cotton falls 50%. Bankruptcies across the nation. Banks fail, including the old Bank of the United States, now rechartered in Pennsylvania. Whigs blame the crisis on Jacksonian economic policies that destroyed the banks. But economic historians say, no, that's not the case. There's a worldwide recession taking place at this point, causing cotton prices to fall. And American banks, American planters, others, suddenly caught in the middle of it. Jackson had very little to do with it. Van Buren had very little to do with it. But Van Buren, while he's a good politician, good organizer behind the scenes, he doesn't have the charisma Jackson has out in public. He isn't able to convince the people that this is part of an international crisis. A crisis has been thrust on the United States. Van Buren really couldn't make an effective argument against Whig arguments that Jackson had destroyed the banks and destroyed the economy. Well, Van Buren responded by proposing an independent sub-treasury. Basically, a new place to house federal deposits, a small bank for the government, will be existing outside the existing banking system. It's not going to affect the banks one way or another. But the Whigs opposed the bill. It didn't pass until 1840. The economy was still in awful shape, and the panic effectively destroyed Van Buren's presidency. Now, as a result of the panic, more states passed homestead legislation to prevent debtors, keep houses being foreclosed on. Some southern banks, such as Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, banned banks. Banks the state of Arkansas formed here nearly bankrupted the state when they went under. Some states began regulating banks more closely, but restricted by the investment many states had state banks. You had a lot of illegal banks emerging, called wildcatter banks. New York and Pennsylvania adopted a system of bank inspection laws, which banks would go and inspect the amount of specie they had on reserve, or inspect the ledgers. There's still no guarantee that depositors are getting lost deposits, even in states with liability laws. Some states pass laws saying that investors and banks are responsible for all bank debts. But there'd be no guarantee that depositors, people who put money into the banks, regular savers, regular folks, would get any of their money back. That would be the case until 1933, that if a bank failed, everything you had in that bank went with it. Entire life savings would be exhausted. So now I go to the election of 1840. The Whigs decide on one candidate. They try to out-Jackson Jackson. William Henry Harrison and Martin Van Buren. Harrison's playing up his credentials as a war hero, saying he's the son of the frontier, saying he was born in a log cabin. He was actually born in a mansion back east. Saying that Van Buren, being from New York, just didn't understand the life of people on the frontier. John Tyler of Virginia, a former Democrat, was chosen as vice president, trying to get some Southern appeal. Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky was the vice president. Heard Van Buren is renominated as vice president. I said Harrison liked drinking hard cider drinks, like apple cider and things, has slight alcohol to them, but trying to call it instead of these Eastern drinks like tea and wine. No, he's drinking the hard stuff here on the frontier. So they called it the Log Cabin Hard Cider Campaign. They're giving out miniature log cabins like the one that Harrison was supposedly born in but wasn't. Jugs of hard cider for the faithful. Rallies and parades for the Whig. Defeated comes to the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek, so he's called Old Tippecanoe. So it's known as Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That's rather vague on the issues. Interestingly enough, my great-grandmother's grandfather was a man named William Henry Harrison Gentry. So you can tell his parents voted. Well, Harrison's vague on the issues, said that Van Buren's man life used to life of luxury, not a life of command on the frontier. You know, Van Buren's one of the few presidents who didn't speak English at home. The whole family spoke Dutch. 78% turnout in the election, because so many states allowing universal male suffrage at this point. One of the highest turnouts ever, 78%. Well, Harrison gets 53% of the popular vote, 234 electoral votes. Van Buren gets the remaining 47% and 60 electoral votes, winning only 7 of 26 states. Democrats in this election are favored by Catholics, Lutherans, Episcopalians, immigrants, backward farmers, generally those with the desire to be left alone. The Whigs, their majority built around rural reformers, anti-immigrant groups, aristocrats, evangelical Protestants, generally believing in progress under an enlightened elite. Some are kind of the evangelical Protestants. Immigrants have always voted for the Democrats. So they have an anti-immigrant party in place. They oppose that. Democrats generally believing in equal opportunities and equal benefits for people. So you can kind of see how these groups are lining up behind a Democratic Party and an anti-democratic party, or they happen to be. Well, as for Harrison, Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1841, is a cold, rainy day in Washington, D.C. Harrison's nearing 70, the oldest man elected president at this point. I want to prove just how tough he was in comparison to Jackson and others, and nor the advice he wear a heavy coat. Basically wore kind of a light suit, kind of like I'm wearing. Stands up in the street to deliver the longest inaugural address on record. Gives a long speech outlining the inaugural agenda, but it's a cold, windy, blustery Washington winter day. And after the longest inaugural address on record, he goes home to has a bad cold. Gets worse, it turns into pneumonia. And 1 month later, the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, is dead. The shortest term in office of any president, 30 days. I guess he showed them how tough he was. Now you have John Tyler. Question now turns to successor. The Constitution said the Vice President would assume the duties of the Vice President, but how do you address him? Is he just Vice President assuming the presidency, or is he actually the President? Is he the President? Is he the acting President? Still the Vice President? John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster, who didn't think much of Tyler to begin with, addressed him as the Vice President acting as President. Tyler said, no, I'm the President. That basically establishes the precedent that the President dies in office, the Vice President is the President. He refuses to answer any mail that was not addressed to him as President John Tyler. Tyler has 15 kids, most of any president. One lived to see Harry Truman be president in the 1940s. After his presidency, serves the remainder of Harrison's term. He served during the Confederate Senate during the Civil War. Let's see how the 1840s shape up.